Watching Morning Live on SABC. If you've just joined us, welcome. If you've been with us, thank you so much for choosing us. Now, an inquiry into sexual harassment at SABC has received the majority of its complaints from the radio division of the public broadcaster. The commission was established in June this year, and for the individual cases that came before the commission, there were individual findings against each case that was lodged by complainants. And to discuss this matter further, I'm joined now by Mfanozelwe Shozi, who is a member of the Commission of Inquiry into Sexual Harassment here at the SABC. Mr. Shozi, thanks so much for your time.
Good morning, my sister.
So let me start here, just looking at the mandate and why your commission was set up. And I was looking at, the objective of the inquiry to determine whether there's a discernible trend of harassment, sexual harassment at the SABC. What did the Commission find in this regard?
Oh, definitely. There is a trend of sexual harassment, more especially in radio. It's also focusing on people that are actually targeting freelancers, people who are not permanent at the SABC. And also is focusing on favors. People want, those who are actually harassing women, they want to give them employment, but in exchange for sex, sometimes in exchange for money. So there is a trend. And if the other trend is that if women refuse this, they are severely victimized by the perpetrators. And most of the women that I've interviewed, most of them have resigned just because they refuse to actually succumb to the request of the alleged perpetrators.
And this, of course, then would speak to an enabling culture within the organization for this to get to the level where it becomes a trend. Definitely.
There is a policy at the SABC, the sexual harassment policy. We have policies and acts in South Africa to actually root out the scourge. But the people who are supposed to implement the policy at the SABC, especially the HR department, they're not using it. One, in most cases, when people have actually lodged complaint of sexual harassment, it's taken lightly. People are not suspended. The investigations are not up to scratch to actually deal with some of the issues that have been raised. Even if their complaints have been lodged, those victims continue to work with the perpetrators. So we could really see, and they ended up victimized in the process. So the culture is there of abusing women, more especially ordinary women. But the other critical issue is that most of the women that have been victimized are young women, and the perpetrators are older men.
And which is, of course, very worrying because you speak to HR and the lack of urgency in dealing with this matter. But were you able to uncover exactly why there was this lack of appetite to deal with it?
One, we found out there's, in most cases, there were collusion between management and perpetrators. Because remember, most of them are also in management. And also HR works with them. And even reports that have been actually investigated in relation to some of these cases were never even given to the perpetrators. And they will also use, for example, in one case, the case was never investigated. It was taken to the CCMA. Even at the CCMA, the SABC used its resources to actually squash the case. So there's a lot of power play here, a lot of collusion around these matters. And we find that these young women don't even have the muscle and the power to fight the perpetrators.
Now, Leanne earlier spoke to CWU and BMAU, who are two workers' unions that represent workers here at the SABC. And you mentioned yesterday during that media briefing that the unions also trivialized in certain instances some of these sexual harassment cases.
We invited about 3 unions here that are active. We invited all 3 of them to come before us. Only 2 came. The others did not even apologize. When we asked them about the cases of sexual harassment they've actually dealt with, they couldn't even identify one. And in one instance, one of the unions was supporting a perpetrator. So even the culture within the unions of assisting perpetrators does not exist. It's not there. And I think the union should actually try by all means to deal with some of these issues. Instead, in our view, they support the perpetrators.
And speaking of these perpetrators, you spoke about, older men. Does older also translate into senior in terms of holding senior positions in the organization?
In almost all the cases, the perpetrators were senior to the survivors. And in most cases, they were also reporting to the survivors, to the perpetrators.
So, in terms of your recommendations, because, you have now investigated these cases and you have come up with findings and recommendations in these regards, what should happen to those whom your evidence has proven to have been guilty of perpetrating these sexual harassments against victims?
We have actually recommended the SABC should reopen these cases, should follow the grievance procedure, should also follow the disciplinary procedures of the organization, so that at least the other parties should also be heard. Why that is important is that there are about 2 perpetrators who were very arrogant, who did not even want to come before us. And we could really see that some of these perpetrators are very shrewd. They've actually developed mechanisms to bypass processes and so on. So we feel that speedily the SABC should actually restart the disciplinary processes. We have made very detailed recommendations on case-by-case basis.
But you were also very scathing in terms of the role that HR at the SABC has played. So given what your observations were in that regard, how do you then expect the very HR that trivialized these instances when it was brought to their attention to deal with it now?
One of the recommendations is that they must also set a panel to monitor the implementation of our recommendations. And that panel should report to the board or the board subcommittee so that all these recommendations are taken seriously and are implemented.
And you also spoke about collusion between those who have been accused and those who are meant to actually exercise oversight in rectifying and dealing with these issues. So if that dynamic hasn't changed, how are you hoping this to play out?
Our report is very clear. We have even named those people. And we think that the SABC, those people, most of the perpetrators are still at the SABC. The victims, most of them, about 90% of them have resigned due to the persistent sexual harassment that they've been getting at the SABC. So we hope then that the SABC know those people. They're not going to be involved in this process, and the panel is going to make sure that it does its work in a very transparent manner. Why
didn't you name them?
No, I'm saying we named them in the report.
But you didn't name them yesterday in the briefing. Why didn't you name them?
No. We remember, this is a constitutional democracy. We don't want the SABC to be taken to task. They must be informed about the allegations. They must come before whatever process that the SABC is going to set up. They must answer for those allegations. So we don't want them today to actually read their names in the paper. So that's why we did not name them. But in the report, their names are there.
So in the future, going forward, this is something that can be made public?
That will depend on the internal SABC policies, on how they actually deal with disciplinary cases, on whether they make them public or not. That is going to be outside our hands as a commission.
And with regard to victimization, because you say most of these perpetrators are still in the employ of the SABC, and even though most of the so-called victims have left the employ of the SABC, some still remain. Aren't you concerned that they may be victimized?
There's one survivor who now has actually written to us to say is being victimized by the alleged line manager because she reports to her, and we have reported that to the HR and to the SABC. Definitely there will be those, and I think there are mechanisms to also report that and also hold them to account. But remember, the policy of the SABC, the 2005 code, also deal with issues of victimization. Those people should be disciplined if they continue to actually victimize people who have actually lodged complaints of sexual harassment.
And also just with regard to the Western Cape, which was a bit of an anomaly because no cases reported from the Western Cape. Was there any further clarity with regard to that?
I think we must also premise that and say that it does not mean then that if the case was never reported, sexual harassment does not take place. it's important also to know that people at the SABC, there was not even a single person who have been convicted, found guilty of sexual harassment. People are afraid to come forward. There's all these issues of victimization. So I think the Commission did not receive any complaint from the Western Cape, but that does not mean then that there is no sexual harassment in the Western Cape. Maybe this report is going to actually assist SABC employees to be able to come forward. If these recommendations are implemented properly, efficiently and transparently, and people are going to come forward, and maybe we can see some of the complaints from the Western Cape. We're not saying that there is no sexual harassment in the Western Cape.
Mr. Shozi, we're out of time, but just a final question. Do you believe that the problem is bigger than the cases that you have investigated?
Much more bigger. The other issue is around the issue of sexual favors. So it's much more bigger, and I think people should come forward and so that these cases could be processed efficiently and transparently.
So do you believe that there should be a follow-up from this point?
What we are saying is that I think there should be a follow-up, and I think the HR, at the executive level, should keep the process open for people to be able to lodge the complaints if they feel that they've been aggrieved.
Mr. Shozi, thank you so much for your time this morning. And talking about that media briefing that was held here yesterday, a report being made public about the inquiry into sexual harassment here at the SABC. And as Mr. Shozi says, and I think frighteningly so, this is perhaps just the tip of the iceberg. Well, we leave it there and take a quick break.